Welcome back to Spirits in the Shadow. Tonight's story comes from a viral post, supposedly based on real events that took place in a quiet apartment building in Seoul. The original poster shared two simple rules left by the previous tenant. Never open the bottom drawer after 3:13 a.m. and never look at your reflection in the dark. They thought it was a joke until they heard a faint noise from the drawer one night. What they saw in the mirror wasn't a monster, but themselves, smiling. Subscribe and follow along, and you'll find out what happens at the end of the story. Story 1. The Drawer, 3:13. Ethan was aggressively, fundamentally ordinary. He existed in that vast, forgettable middle ground of high school life, not smart enough for the academic elite, not athletic enough for the varsity teams, and not charismatic enough to be a social linchpin. His purpose, as far as he understood it, was a simple, trudging marathon. Get through the grueling Korean education system with grades decent enough to land a respectable spot at a university in Seoul. His life was a predictable rhythm of cram school, lukewarm cafeteria lunches, and aimless evenings scrolling through webtoons in his perfectly normal, slightly messy bedroom. It was a life so relatable, so utterly commonplace, that it felt insulated from anything truly strange. He was just another face in the crowd, and that was exactly how he liked it. His environment was the sterile, fluorescent-lit ecosystem of Seongjin High. The hallways smelled of floor wax and teenage anxiety. The classrooms were filled with the drowsy hum of lectures and the frantic scratching of pens. It was a world of uniforms, hierarchies, and unspoken rules. One of those unspoken rules involved Leo. Leo was the kind of boy teachers forget is even on the class roster. He was a ghost long before anything supernatural entered Ethan's life. He had a permanent hunch, as if constantly trying to shrink himself out of existence, his eyes always fixed on the scuffed tips of his own shoes. He never raised his hand, never spoke unless spoken to, and never, ever made eye contact. He was a blank space, a perfect, non-reactive target for the casual cruelty of bored teenagers. For Ethan and his friends, it wasn't malicious, not really. It was just something to do, a way to break the monotony, a prod to see if the blank space would react. On this particular Tuesday, the prod went a little further. As Leo shuffled past their corner in the bustling hallway, Ethan's friend Mark stuck out a foot. Leo stumbled, and in that moment of graceless recovery, Ethan acted on a dumb impulse. He reached out and snatched Leo's worn leather satchel. "What have you got in here, huh? Textbooks or bricks?" Ethan laughed, the sound hollow even to his own ears. He expected the bag to be light, flimsy. Instead, it swung with a surprising weight, and as he fumbled it, a solid, heavy object inside shifted with a dull, definitive thud. It sounded like a wooden box, something dense and old. Leo froze completely. For the first time, his head snapped up, and his dark eyes, wide with a raw, desperate panic, locked with Ethan's. The intensity of the gaze was so jarring that Ethan instinctively shoved the bag back into Leo's chest. A strange scent wafted from the worn leather, faint, chalky, like powdered seashells mixed with a dry, herbal incense. Leo clutched the bag as if it were a lifeline, turned, and practically fled down the hall, melting back into the crowd. The incident was forgotten by the time the final bell rang. Ethan went home, ate the dinner his mother left for him, and settled at his desk to face a mountain of calculus homework. His room was his sanctuary, a typical student's den cluttered with textbooks, manga volumes, and discarded snack wrappers. The centerpiece was a sturdy wooden desk, a hand-me-down from his older brother. It was familiar, solid, real. Sleep came easily, but something pulled him out of it in the deep silence of the night. His eyes blinked open, adjusting to the gloom. A pale, bluish light from his phone screen cut through the darkness. The time was 3:13 a.m. As his gaze drifted from the phone, he heard it, a soft, scraping sound. Skrrk. It was the sound of wood on wood, hesitant and faint. His eyes darted to his desk. The middle drawer, the one that always stuck, had slid open by a centimetre. He stared, his heart beginning a low, heavy drum against his ribs. It was probably just the house settling. The wood expanding or contracting. He was half asleep, imagining things. He got up, padded across the cold floor, and firmly pushed the drawer shut. It clunked into place with satisfying finality. He got back in bed and, after a long while, fell into a restless sleep. The next night, he woke up again with the same chilling certainty of being watched. He didn't need to check his phone. He knew the time. He lay perfectly still, listening, his ears straining against the oppressive silence. Nothing. No scraping. No movement. A wave of relief washed over him. It had been nothing. Just his imagination working overtime. He allowed himself to relax, to breathe. His eyes drifted idly around the room, settling on the tall wardrobe mirror that stood opposite his bed. And then the breath he had just taken caught in his throat, turning to ice in his lungs. In the real world, his desk was inert, its drawers all perfectly, solidly closed. But in the mirror's dark, silvery reflection, the middle drawer was wide open. It gaped into the reflected room like a silent, screaming mouth. The darkness inside it was absolute, a patch of void that seemed to drink the dim light. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a contradiction, a violation of logic that made his mind reel. He scrambled out of bed, his hands trembling, and snatched the thick comforter, flinging it over the mirror until the terrifying image was gone. He spent the rest of the night huddled under his thin remaining blanket, his back pressed against the wall, staring at the desk, waiting for a dawn that felt impossibly far away. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no escape. He dreamt he was back at school, but the halls were empty and stretched on into an unnatural infinity. The only other person was the old, stooped janitor, who was methodically sweeping the corridor with a bamboo broom. But he wasn't sweeping the whole floor. He was sweeping a precise area of just 3 square tiles, over and over again. Swish, swish, swish. The debris he gathered wasn't dust or dirt. It was a small pile of fine, yellow scraps, like the charred remains of paper talismans. The air was thick with that same chalky seashell scent from Leo's bag. The janitor didn't look up from his work, but his voice echoed in the cavernous hallway, raspy and dry as dead leaves. "You wouldn't keep it closed," he said, his voice devoid of accusation, a mere statement of fact. "Now it wants to keep you." Ethan woke up drenched in sweat, his heart hammering. The dream clung to him like a shroud all morning. At school, he was jumpy, irritable. The familiar classroom felt alien, threatening. He saw Leo by the lockers between classes. He looked paler than usual, if that was even possible. Driven by a desperation he didn't understand. Ethan cornered him. "What was in your bag?" Ethan demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. Leo flinched, his eyes immediately dropping to the floor. He seemed to shrink even further into himself. He mumbled something inaudible. "What?" Ethan pressed, grabbing his arm. Leo finally looked up, his eyes holding the same panicked terror from the day before. He spoke in a whisper so faint it was almost carried away by the hallway noise. "If you have to look, don't look in the mirror." His grip on his own satchel tightened. "And if it's open, don't do it after that hour." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, Leo wrenched his arm free and disappeared into the stream of students. That night, Ethan was determined to stay awake. He turned on every light in his room, put on headphones with loud music, and tried to focus on his phone. But as the hours crept by, a leaden drowsiness overcame him. His head lolled, his eyes closed. When they snapped open again, the music was off. The room was dark and silent. He fumbled for his phone. The screen lit up. 3:13. Then it flickered and stayed there. The numbers wouldn't change. 3:13. 3:13. 3:13. Panic set in, cold and sharp. He tried to restart the phone, but the screen was frozen on those malevolent digits. And in that suffocating, tech-induced silence, a new sound began. Ding dong. The doorbell, clear and polite. He froze. Who would be at the door at this hour? His parents were heavy sleepers. They wouldn't have heard it. Ding dong. The second ring was just as calm, just as patient. A cold dread, heavier and more absolute than anything he had ever known, settled in his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that he should not move, should not make a sound. Ding dong. The third ring, a polite, insistent trinity. And from downstairs, he heard the faint telltale creak of the front door swinging slowly open. The first sign was the drawer. For 3 consecutive nights, I found the top drawer of my wooden desk slightly ajar. A dark sliver of a mouth in the dim light of my bedroom. It was an old, heavy piece of furniture, prone to sticking, not sliding open on its own. The first time, I simply shoved it shut, the wood groaning in protest. Probably the humidity, I reasoned, making the runners swell. The second night, a flicker of annoyance went through me. I made a point of pushing it firmly until I heard the dull thud of wood meeting frame. Yet the next morning, there it was again, open by a finger's width. My mind scrambled for logic. Maybe the floor was uneven, a slight, imperceptible tilt I'd never noticed before. It was a stupid explanation, and I knew it. But it was better than the alternative that was beginning to form in the quiet, dark corners of my thoughts. A deep, instinctual part of me felt a cold prickle of unease. A sense that this wasn't a quirk of physics, but a quiet, deliberate invitation. The house was settling, I told myself, but the lie was as thin as the draft I suddenly felt on my neck. An object at rest is meant to stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. That was the rule. But the drawer suggested a new, unspoken rule was now at play in my small universe, and I was the only one subject to its jurisdiction. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was a low hum of anxiety that started in my gut and radiated outwards, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. I started leaving the main light on until the very last second before sleep. A childish habit I thought I had long outgrown. It was during a frantic search for a misplaced textbook that my hand, digging into the messy depths of my backpack, brushed against something I didn't recognize. It was a slip of paper, impossibly thin and stiff, with a texture that felt less like pulp and more like dried skin. I pulled it out. It was a yellow talisman, the colour of old bruises, folded into a neat, tight rectangle. I didn't own anything like this. My first thought was of Leo. He was quiet, spiritual, always clutching some sort of good luck charm. He must have dropped it before. My stomach twisted with the familiar, acidic taste of shame. I'd cornered him by the lockers just last week, my friends laughing as I knocked his books from his hands. This must have fallen out then. I should just throw it away, a relic of a memory I wanted to bury. Yet, I hesitated. Something about the object felt significant, heavy with an unearned importance. I placed it on my desk, right beside my lamp, with the vague intention of returning it. But the thought of facing Leo, of seeing the quiet fear in his eyes, was more daunting than any inexplicable phenomenon. The talisman sat there, a silent accusation. Anyone else would see it as a simple piece of paper, a cultural trinket. But for the audience to my life's unfolding horror, it was Chekhov's cursed gun, placed on the mantelpiece in the first act, promising a devastating report by the third. It was a link, a physical manifestation of my cruelty, and I had just willingly brought it into my home, placing it on the very desk whose drawer refused to stay closed. That night, the invitation was no longer subtle. I woke up abruptly, though to what? I wasn't sure. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and thick like velvet. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I saw it. The drawer wasn't just ajar, it was pulled all the way out, a gaping void, and sitting perfectly in its centre, illuminated by a stray beam of moonlight, was the yellow talisman. My rationalizations evaporated, replaced by a wave of pure, cold dread. I was no longer an observer of odd coincidences, but the subject of a direct, impossible statement. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was no wind. The windows were locked. My body moved with a will of its own, drawn by a morbid gravity. I reached out a trembling hand and picked up the paper. It felt warm, as if it had been held in a palm for hours. I unfolded it under the harsh, white glare of my desk lamp. The strokes on the inside were not ink. They were finer, like engravings made with a single strand of hair, forming characters that swam before my eyes. And then they resolved into two distinct, terrifying truths: my full name and a string of words that made the blood drain from my face. The mirror, second-year laboratory. The memory, suppressed and willingly forgotten, broke through the dam. Second year, an abandoned science wing. A group of us, arrogant and bored, daring each other to new heights of stupidity. We found it in an old storage closet, an ornate, full-length mirror. its silvering tarnished at the edges like spreading mold. Taped to its corner was a yellowed, typewritten note. Warning, do not look after sunset. We had laughed, treating it as a joke left by a previous generation of students. It became the centerpiece of our hazing. My target had been Leo. I had dragged him, kicking and pleading, into the pitch-black lab long after the sun had bled from the sky. I held him in front of it, his face pale and tear-streaked in the singular invasive beam of my phone's flashlight, forcing him to stare into his own reflection in the suffocating darkness. The rational mind can no longer offer comfort when confronted with proof that the irrational is hunting you by name. The audience already knew this was no random haunting. This was a reaping. My past actions had sown a seed in the dark, and now, years later, it was finally beginning to sprout. The talisman wasn't a charm Leo had dropped. It was a receipt for a debt I didn't even know I owed. The visit to Leo's mother was a blur of shame and terror. I showed her the paper, and the weary recognition in her eyes was more damning than any accusation. She didn't speak. She simply led me to a small room at the back of her apartment, the air thick with the smell of incense and dried herbs. She placed the talisman inside a small, dark wooden box. As she was about to close the lid, a sound began to resonate, not in the room, but inside my skull, a clear, piercing chime, like a single perfect bell struck by an invisible hammer. It was a nauseating, invasive sound that vibrated directly against my brain tissue. I flinched, clamping my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The sound wasn't external. Leo's mother seemed to notice my distress, but was unperturbed, as if this was an expected part of the process. She took a pinch of fine, bone-colored powder and sprinkled it over the talisman. I watched, mesmerized, as the yellow paper seemed to darken, to absorb the powder as a parched throat takes water, before lying still, as if sated. "We only showed it where to gather," she said, her voice a low, somber whisper. "It likes the empty space you left inside him." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. It wasn't that I had summoned something. It was that my cruelty had created a vacuum, a spiritual wound, and something else had simply moved in to occupy it. The audience understands now. This is not a ghost story, but a tale of spiritual parasitism. The entity wasn't a vengeful spirit from the mirror. It was a creature of opportunity, drawn to the void of fear and humiliation I had carved into another person's soul. She handed me the now sealed box and a list of instructions, rules for a game I never agreed to play. "It will follow you for a time. Its attention is fixed," she warned, her eyes boring into mine. "Do not look at your reflection in any surface after sunset. And," she added, her voice dropping even lower, "do not answer calls from your own number." That last rule seemed absurd, a piece of modern folklore thrown in with ancient superstition. It felt like a line from a cheap horror movie, a detail so bizarre I might have dismissed it had my head not still been ringing with the phantom echo of that bell. I wanted to rationalize it as a prank, a scare tactic, but looking at her grim, unyielding face, I knew it was as serious a warning as the one about the mirror. This was the new covenant. The curse had adapted, bridging the gap between the old world of haunted objects and the new one of constant connectivity. For the audience, This is the final, terrifying turn of the screw. The threat is no longer confined to a specific place or object. It has become mobile, personal, and technologically proficient. It can reach out and touch me through the very device I carry for a sense of safety and connection. I follow the rules. I bully no one. I walk through the world with my eyes downcast, a ghost in my own life. The box with the talisman is buried deep in my closet, but it offers little comfort. The entity is not gone. It is patient. Sometimes, in the dead of night, at exactly 3:13 a.m., I hear it. It's not a loud noise. It's the faint, dry rasp of duct tape, the thick layers I've wrapped around my desk drawer, vibrating softly, peeling away inch by inch under some imperceptible, persistent pressure. And the cheap movie poster I've taped over my bedroom mirror will gently flutter, billowing out and then sucking back in, as if a mouth on the other side is soundlessly speaking my name. It is a constant, quiet reminder that I am not alone, and that the consequences of my past are not just a memory, but a breathing, waiting presence in my room. Story 2, Seat 31. Daechidong did not sleep, so neither did I. Its rhythm was dictated by the frantic ticking of 1,000 exam clocks and fueled by convenience store coffee that tasted of burnt ambition. My sanctuary, the 24/7 study hall, was less a place of learning and more a holding pen for anxious minds. My seat was C30, a small patch of worn laminate I called my own. Next to it, C31 remained a void, a silent testament to the manager's cryptic warning. Don't sit there, especially not late at night. The first time it happened, on that lonely Thursday, I'd dismissed it as a trick of a sleep-deprived mind. The disembodied scratching, the pencil moving on the bare desk as if held by a phantom hand. When I'd asked the manager, his face, etched with the permanent fatigue of someone who herds broken dreams for a living, had softened for just a moment. He told me about Alex Park. 3 years a repeater, 3 years in this very room, until his heart, squeezed dry by pressure and sleeplessness, had simply stopped, right there. In seat C31, time of death, 11:30 p.m. The story was a chilling piece of local folklore, and I had tried to bury it under stacks of textbooks and practice exams. But fear has a way of seeping through the cracks of logic. The next night, a Friday, I came armed with defiance. I plugged in my bulky, noise-cancelling headphones, turning up a playlist of Baroque concertos until Vivaldi's strings were a frantic wall of sound against the world. I would not look at C31. I would not think about Alex Park. I would conquer my chapter on differential calculus and ignore the ghost in the machine. For hours, it worked. The world shrank to the pool of white light on my desk, the elegant dance of numbers and symbols. But as the clock on my phone screen crept past 11:10 p.m., a low thrum began to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. It was subtle, like a distant subway train, but it was rhythmic. Thump, 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 thump. I pulled off my headphones. The violins vanished, replaced by a silence that was somehow louder. And then I heard it. Scritch! Scratch, scratch! Scritch! It was back. The sound was coming from C31. It was different this time, faster, more erratic. It wasn't the steady pace of someone taking notes. It was the desperate, jagged sound of a mind racing against time, of a hand trying to outrun a failing memory. I squeezed my eyes shut, my own pencil frozen over an equation. It's the building's plumbing, I told myself. It's a mouse in the wall. It's anything but what you think it is. I chanced a look. The other two students in the vast room were islands of oblivion. A boy in the front row was slumped over, his cheek pressed against a thick history textbook, his chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of sleep. A girl near the window typed with furious speed, her face illuminated by the blue glow of her laptop, the click-clack of her keys, a counter-rhythm to the scratching. Neither of them noticed. My gaze drifted to C31. The same yellow pencil lay on the desk, and it was moving. It danced and jerked across the wooden surface, leaving no mark. A frantic pantomime of study. It scribbled furiously for a few seconds, then stopped, then started again, as if its invisible user had forgotten a key formula and was trying to dredge it up from the depths of an exhausted brain. The sight was so absurd, so impossible, that a hysterical laugh almost bubbled up in my throat. The clock on my phone turned to 11:30 p.m. Instantly. The scratching stopped. The pencil wobbled for a moment and then lay still. The oppressive silence rushed back in, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant wail of a siren. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat in the sudden quiet. I had survived another night. By Saturday, the fear had curdled into a kind of grim anxiety. I considered going to a cafe, but the thought of spending money on overpriced lattes just to be surrounded by cheerful chatter felt like a betrayal of the Spartan discipline Daechidong demanded. I had to go back. I had to study. So I went early, hoping to finish my work before the witching hour. At 11 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. It began not with a sound, but with a feeling. A deep, penetrating cold emanated from C31, a pocket of winter in the stuffy, climate-controlled room. It was a damp, still cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I rubbed my arms, my breath fogging for a fleeting second in the air. Then came the scratching. It was louder now, sharp and angry. The frantic energy was still there, but it was laced with a raw frustration. The sound was joined by a soft, incessant tapping. Tap, 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 tap. The sound of an impatient foot, of time running out. I couldn't help but look. The yellow pencil was practically convulsing on the desktop. And as I leaned slightly, my blood ran cold. It wasn't just random scribbling. The pencil was tracing the unmistakable hexagonal shape of a benzene ring, a diagram I had spent the entire afternoon trying to memorize. It sketched the shape, then paused, then added the double bonds with quick, vicious slashes. It was a ghostly revision session. Then, as if its user was unsatisfied, the pencil was lifted an inch into the air by an unseen force and slammed back down onto the desk with a sharp crack that echoed in the quiet room. A sound like a faint, defeated sigh seemed to follow it, a whisper of pure despair. I gasped, jumping in my seat. This time, someone noticed me. The girl with the laptop looked up from her screen, her brow furrowed in annoyance. She pulled one earbud out. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone making it clear she was not asking out of concern. Did you hear that?" I stammered, pointing a trembling finger toward the empty seat. A loud crack. From that desk. She stared at the empty chair, then back at me, her expression a mixture of pity and disdain. "I didn't hear anything but you," she said flatly, before plugging her earbud back in and returning to her work. She had dismissed me. I was just another stressed-out student, cracking under the pressure. Maybe she was right. The next day, I confronted the manager. I found him wiping down the already spotless front counter, his movements methodical and weary. "It's happening again," I said, my voice low and urgent. "At C31, the pencil, the sounds. It's getting worse." He didn't stop his wiping. He didn't even look at me. "I told you," he said, his voice a monotone. "This place is a pressure cooker. You're not sleeping enough. Your mind plays tricks on you. Get some fresh air, drink some water, but don't cause a fuss. Everyone here has their own ghosts to deal with. Focus on yours." His words were a brick wall. There was no help here. No one would believe me. The fear was now tangled with a profound sense of isolation. I was alone with Alex Park's ghost, trapped in a cycle of endless, fruitless study. That evening, a strange feeling began to replace my fear. It was a heavy, aching pity. Pity for the boy who had died in that chair, whose ambition had been so great it had literally untethered him from life, leaving behind only this sad, frantic echo. That Monday night, I didn't even try to study. I sat at C30 and just waited. I felt a strange sense of responsibility, as if I were the sole witness to a quiet, repeating tragedy. At 10:45 p.m., the chill returned, seeping into my bones. The scratching began, but it was different, slower, more deliberate. I watched, mesmerized, as the pencil rose from the desk and began to move. It wasn't drawing diagrams or formulas tonight. It was writing, one painstaking letter at a time, etched invisibly onto the wood. A, G, A, I, N, again. The single word hung in the air, a silent scream of eternal recurrence. He was trapped, doomed to take the test, fail the test, and study for the test again and again, forever. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, so powerful it stung my eyes. This wasn't a horror story. It was a tragedy. My eyes flicked to the clock. 11:29 p.m. The pencil was beginning to scratch again, starting the frantic, final minute of its torment. In that moment, an impulse born of empathy overrode every ounce of fear. I leaned across the small divide between our desks, my voice a raw whisper in the cold, silent air. "It's okay, Alex," I said, the name feeling strangely familiar on my tongue. "You can stop now. It's over." The pencil froze. The frantic scratching ceased. The air became utterly still, heavy with a silent, waiting tension. The clock on my phone ticked over to 11:30 p.m. The pencil dropped, clattering softly onto the desk. The oppressive cold dissolved, melting back into the room's stale warmth. The presence was gone. The room was just a room. C31 was just an empty chair. For the first time in nights, the silence felt peaceful. But as I sat there, my own reflection staring back at me from the dark window, a new, chilling thought took root in my mind. Had I freed him? Or had he just passed the burden on to me? The air in the university dormitory's late-night study hall always felt thin and stretched, humming with the silent, frantic energy of 100 minds pushed to their breaking point. It was 3 a.m., a time when the world outside held its breath. But in here, The only currency was caffeine and desperation. My own textbook, a dense volume on advanced macroeconomics, lay open before me, its pages a blur of graphs and theories that had long since lost their meaning. My head throbbed in a dull, rhythmic protest. Around me, other students, my fellow candidates in this brutal academic marathon, were scattered like fallen soldiers. Some slumped over their desks, others staring blankly at glowing laptop screens, their faces pale in the artificial light. But there was another presence here, one that had been growing stronger for weeks. It started as a subtle chill that clung to one corner of the hall, near the window overlooking the old C-block dorms. Then came the whispers, so faint they could be mistaken for the wind or the rustle of turning pages from across the room. I was the only one who seemed to notice. It's a strange and lonely burden, seeing the echoes of those who have passed, spirits tethered to a place by the sheer, uncuttable weight of their final emotions. For me, it wasn't a gift. It was a constant, low-level hum of static beneath the surface of the living world. Tonight, the static was screaming. It began with the light above the desk in the far corner, the one everyone subconsciously avoided, starting to flicker. Not the gentle, rhythmic flicker of a dying bulb, but a frantic, irregular strobing, as if it were trying to Morse code a message of pure panic. The temperature in the room plummeted. I saw goosebumps rise on the arms of a girl 2 tables away, saw her shiver and pull her cardigan tighter, oblivious to the true cause. My breath plumed in front of me, a small fleeting cloud in the suddenly frigid air. The low hum in my mind intensified, sharpening into a distinct feeling. Despair. It was a thick, cloying despair, heavy with the metallic scent of graphite and the stale odour of sleepless nights. Then, I saw him. He wasn't there 1 second, and then he was coalescing from the strained silence and the desperate energy that saturated the room. At first, he was just a smudge in the air, a heat haze mirage in the freezing cold. But the smudge thickened, swirling like smoke being poured into an invisible mould. It took on a shape, a young man, probably my age, impossibly thin, wearing the standard issue grey V-neck sweater of the university. He was translucent, a phantom of mist and memory. I could see the bookshelf and the brick wall right through his wavering form. He sat at the empty desk under the strobing light, a stack of textbooks in front of him that hadn't been there moments before. They too were spectral, their titles shimmering and unreadable. The manifestation was more complete than any I had ever witnessed. He was no mere echo. He was a wound, a looping psychic trauma carved into the very fabric of the place. He was utterly, terrifyingly real. His head was bowed in intense concentration. The light above cast his face in deep, dramatic shadow. But I could see his eyes. They weren't eyes anymore. They were hollowed-out pits of shadow, voids of exhaustion that seemed to suck in the very light around them. His skin was the colour of old parchment, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. His lips were bloodless, moving constantly, forming silent, frantic words. And then the sounds began, clear and undeniable. First, the rustle of pages. His hand, a blurry, indistinct smear of motion, was flipping through a textbook at an impossible speed. It wasn't the sound of reading. It was the sound of a desperate, panicked search, a riffling, tearing noise like 1,000 moths beating their wings at once. Shf, 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 shf. The sound was fast, inhuman, relentless. Then came the whispering. It slithered across the room, a sibilant, corrosive litany of self-hatred. Stupid, stupid, so stupid. The voice was thin and reedy, cracking with a despair so profound it made my own anxieties feel trivial. Too slow. I'm too slow. Have to be faster. Have to remember. Why can't I remember? The most horrifying sound was the dull, rhythmic thud. It was soft, but it cut through the silence like a drumbeat. Thump, thump, thump. I watched, my blood turning to ice, as he gently, methodically, knocked his forehead against the solid oak of the desk. He didn't seem to feel it. It was just another part of the ritual, a physical punishment for his perceived failure. With every soft impact, his form flickered more violently, the whispers growing more intense. Useless. Worthless. I have to pass. I have to. This wasn't just a ghost. It was a soul trapped in a self-made hell, performing a ritual of academic torment for an audience of no one. I was frozen in my chair, pinned by a fear so absolute it felt like a physical weight on my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the room, to leave this broken spirit to his endless, agonizing loop. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the ghost's methodical thudding. The air was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. The danger here wasn't of a physical attack. It was the terrifying proximity to his bottomless despair. His pain was contagious, a psychic contagion that threatened to pull me under. He was a dark reflection of every student's deepest fear. The fear of not being good enough. The fear of breaking under the pressure. I looked at my own textbook, at the looming deadline for my thesis, and I felt the cold tendrils of his hopelessness snake around my own heart. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a profound, aching empathy. I knew that gaze. I knew that desperation. I had seen it in the mirror. I was a C2, a candidate, just like him. We were soldiers in the same war. My limbs felt like lead, but I forced myself to stand. My chair scraped against the floor, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the tense silence. The ghost didn't flinch. His entire existence was focused on the shimmering, useless book in front of him. I walked toward him, each step an act of will. The cold intensified as I drew closer, a biting, unnatural frost that seeped into my bones. The whispers grew louder, a vortex of self-loathing that swirled around his head. When I stood beside his desk, I could see the fine, shimmering dust on its surface, the ghostly residue of countless hours of frantic pencil work. Under the flickering lamp, I could just make out how the spectral graphite dust had settled, spelling out a number. 31. C31. The dorm room number from the old block. The one that had been locked up for years after a student. After he. My voice was a raw, trembling thing when I finally spoke. You're a fellow candidate, aren't you? For the first time, the frantic motion paused. The blurring hands stilled. The whispering stopped. The thudding ceased. Slowly, agonizingly. He lifted his head. Looking into those hollow, shadow-filled eyes was like staring into an abyss. There was a flicker of something deep within them, Not malice, but a vast soul-crushing confusion. He didn't speak, but the question hung in the air between us. "You can rest now," I whispered, my voice shaking. He stared at me, his brow furrowed in a spectral frown. His lips parted, and a voice like dry leaves scraping pavement filled the space. "Rest? How can I? The exam, it's not over." I had to tell him. I had to be the one to cut the thread that tied him to this endless loop. I took a shallow, ragged breath. "It is," I said, my voice barely audible but clear in the silent room. "You already passed." Recognition is a powerful thing. It can be a key, or it can be a hammer. For him, it was both. A shudder ran through his entire form. He looked down at his hands, then at the textbook on the desk. He reached for it, his misty fingers sinking straight through the cover. The book didn't move. He tried again, a look of pure panic dawning on his face. He swiped at it, his arm passing through the spectral pages as if they were nothing more than smoke. The book, the desk, his own relentless studies, they were no longer tangible to him. He was a memory, and his anchor to the world was dissolving. His form began to blur, the edges softening and becoming indistinct, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. A sound tore from his throat, a sound of utter heartbreak. It wasn't a scream, but a low, wrenching sob that carried the weight of years of unspoken pressure and fear. Tears, shimmering and insubstantial, traced paths down his ghostly cheeks. I felt my own eyes well up in response. "You did your best," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You did everything you could. No one blames you." He looked up at me one last time, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking moment, the hollow pits of his eyes were gone. They were just the eyes of a tired young man. The deep lines of stress on his face softened. He gave me a small, weary, grateful smile, and then he was gone. He didn't vanish. He dissolved. He unraveled into motes of shimmering dust, like the graphite on the desk, and drifted away on a silent breeze, leaving behind only the lingering cold and the profound, echoing silence. The light above the desk stopped flickering and cast a steady, gentle glow. The room was just a room again. I stood there for a long time, the silence ringing in my ears. The lesson from Alex. I knew his name now. A whisper left in my mind was a brutal one. Work hard. Do your best, but do not destroy yourself. There is a line between dedication and self-annihilation, and he had crossed it with fatal consequences. Now, whenever I'm in that study hall late at night, and I see a student with hollowed-out eyes, hunched over a book in a silent panic, I feel a chill, and every time I pass the locked door of room C31, I pause for a moment. I press my hand to the cool wood, and I whisper to the silence within, "Sleep well, Alex." His story remains a quiet broadcast from the other side, a plea for all of us to not just subscribe to the endless race, but to comment on our own well-being, to remember that we are more than our final grade. Story 3. The Perfect Student. We never used knives. Knives are messy, unsubtle. They leave evidence. Our craft was cleaner, an art form of psychological erosion. In the halls of Seoul High, my friends and I, Kyle, Wade, and myself, Sean, were architects of misery. We understood that true power wasn't in a punch, but in the slow, meticulous dismantling of a person's soul until they were living yet not alive. We could make a person a ghost in their own life, and we were damn good at it. Then Aidan transferred in. He was perfect. His uniform was always impeccably pressed, his hair neatly parted, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He bowed to the teachers, answered questions with unnerving precision, and offered a serene, placid smile to everyone he met. But his eyes never smiled. They were calm, dark pools that seemed to absorb the light around them, reflecting nothing back. And when he thought no one was watching, he would look at us. It wasn't a glare, not a plea for help. It was an observation. He watched us the way a scientist watches a microbe under a microscope, with a detached, analytical curiosity that slid under my skin and stayed there. He was the perfect target, an unbroken toy. We started small, the usual hazing rituals. A tripped foot in the hallway, a misplaced textbook. Aidan would fall, gather his things without a word, and continue on. His politeness was a shield we couldn't seem to dent. So, we escalated. Kyle, whose cruelty was as thoughtless and blunt as his fists, made it a daily routine to empty Aidan's lunch tray. Sometimes he'd dump it on the floor. Other times, he'd pour the lukewarm soup directly over Aidan's pristine uniform. Aidan never flinched. He would simply stand there, dripping with broth and humiliation, bow slightly, and walk away to clean himself up. Wade, the schemer, preferred financial torment. He'd corner Aidan, his hand extended, and Aidan would quietly hand over his lunch money without being asked. It became a tax, a tribute for the privilege of being allowed to breathe the same air as us. My own contribution was more academic. I was lazy but smart, and I hated homework. Aidan, it turned out, could mimic my handwriting perfectly. Every morning, he would slide my completed assignments onto my desk, pages filled with flawless answers. Through it all, he never spoke a word against us. He never went to a teacher. He never fought back. His silence was infuriating. It was a vacuum, and we poured more and more of our sadism into it, trying to elicit a response, a crack, anything. Weird things started to happen. A potted ficus on the windowsill next to Aidan's desk, one that had been thriving for years, began to wither. Its leaves curled, turned a sickly brown, and dropped to the floor, while every other plant in the classroom flourished. Teachers, who had initially fawned over the brilliant new student, began to skip over him. Their eyes would slide past his raised hand as if he weren't there. It was as if a bubble of nothingness was expanding around him, wilting and erasing everything it touched. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. We had kept him after class, the four of us forming a loose cage around his desk in the empty room. The winter sun was weak, and the long classroom was lit by the cold, humming fluorescent bars on the ceiling. I was about to drop a fresh pile of textbooks on his desk for that night's work when he finally spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He didn't look up from the notebook he was writing in. "I have learned so much from all of you." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air snaked through the room. Wade scoffed. "Learned what? How to be our doormat." Aidan finally lifted his head. The air temperature plummeted, I could see my own breath mist in front of my face. A pale plume in the sterile light. I glanced down at the floor. The overhead lights were bright, casting sharp, defined shadows from the desks, from Kyle and Wade, from me. But under Aiden's chair, there was nothing, just a clean patch of linoleum. He cast no shadow. "I learned cruelty," he said, and his eyes met mine. They were no longer just dark. The pupils had dilated, bleeding outwards until his irises were gone, leaving two orbs of pure, depthless black. His gaze shifted to Kyle, though his hand never stopped writing in his notebook. The scratch of the pen, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the frozen room. "Kyle," he said, his voice a monotone, "your father doesn't work late on Tuesdays and Fridays. He goes to a small bar in Apgujeong. He meets a woman there. Her name is Sophie. She's the reason your mother cries in the shower when she thinks no one can hear." Kyle's face went white. He took a staggering step back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Aiden's black eyes swiveled to Wade. "You tell everyone your family is rich. But your mother sold her wedding ring last Thursday to pay for your grandfather's hospital bills. The loan sharks left a notice on your door yesterday. You burned it before your parents got home." Wade began to tremble, a low whimper escaping his lips. Then he looked at me. The pen stopped moving. The silence was absolute. "Sean," he whispered, and the sound of my own name felt like a violation. "Your little sister, Hannah, gets out of cram school at 4. She likes to take the shortcut through the alley behind the Taekboki restaurant. She thinks it's safe. And your grandmother, who lives alone, that broken lock on her front door is so easy to forget about, isn't it? It hasn't latched properly all week. A firm push would be all it takes." He wasn't threatening me. He was just sharing facts, laying out the architecture of my life, showing me all the structural weaknesses. He was reading my deepest fears from a script only he could see. He had learned our craft. All right. He had taken our messy, brutish cruelty and perfected it, sharpened it into a surgeon's scalpel, and was now showing us exactly where he could cut. I fled. I didn't say a word. I turned and ran out of that classroom, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't stop running until I was home. My hands shook so violently I could barely dial my sister's number. I screamed at her, a frantic, incoherent order to never ever use that alley again. That night, I took a toolbox to my grandmother's house and I didn't leave until her door was fortified with 3 new locks. I abandoned that school. I concocted a story for my parents, a lie about bullying that was a pale shadow of the truth. I begged, I pleaded, and I transferred to a school on the other side of the city within a week. I never saw Kyle or Wade again. Our bond, forged in casual cruelty, was instantly dissolved by a terror that was anything but casual. Years have passed. I have a job, a life. But the scars are still there, etched on the inside of my soul. I am pathologically obsessed with locks. A sudden drop in temperature makes my blood run cold. Sometimes, I'll see a student with a polite, empty smile, and I have to fight the urge to run. I survived Aiden, but only in the most technical sense of the word. The careless, confident boy I was died in that classroom, slain by a perfect student who showed me the true reflection of my own monstrosity. I never learned what happened to him, and I have never been brave enough to find out. I just know that he is out there somewhere, a ghost I created, forever casting no shadow. The piece of paper trembled in Aidan Park's hand, not from any weakness in his grip, but because my entire world was shaking. His handwriting was flawless, a calligrapher's dream, each stroke placed with an unnerving precision that defied the frantic energy of a typical student. But it was the repetition that broke me. Down the entire page, the same sentence was written over and over, a perfect, damning mantra. I visit your families when you sleep. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a log entry. The air in the classroom, which should have been stuffy and warm from the humming heaters, had turned sharp and glacial. A profound, unnatural cold radiated from Aidan, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter outside. It was the chill of the grave, of absolute finality. I could see my breath, a thick white plume, and then the breaths of the 7 bullies cowering behind me. We were being flash frozen in place, our terror a tangible, crystalline thing. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to shed a cold, blue-white glare, like the light of a distant, dying star, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced at the edge of our vision. Aidan's face was placid, his expression one of serene focus, as if he were merely presenting his homework for grading. That was the last thing I saw before the cold consumed everything, and the world dissolved into a silent, white void. I woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the muted beeping of a machine. The next 3 days were a blur of worried nurses, hushed conversations I couldn't quite decipher, and the blinding white of hospital sheets. My body ached with a deep, penetrating cold that no blanket could warm, a cellular memory of the classroom. The doctors called it severe hypothermia and shock, a medical mystery given that I was found in a heated school building. But I knew it wasn't a medical event. It was an exorcism that had failed. When the principal and a detective finally came to question me, I told them everything, my voice hoarse and brittle. I told them about Aidan Park, the transfer student, the perfect assignments, the cold, and the horrifying list he showed me. They listened patiently, their faces a mixture of pity and disbelief. The detective's final words echoed in the sterile room long after they left. "Son, we've checked every record. The Ministry of Education has no file. This school has no file. There has never been a student named Aidan Park enrolled here." My world fractured again. Was I insane? Had we collectively hallucinated him? They discharged me a day later. My clothes returned to me in a plastic bag. As I dressed, my fingers brushed against a folded sheaf of papers in my jacket pocket. It wasn't mine. I pulled it out. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and brittle to the touch. It was a list, several pages long, filled with names, dozens of them. I recognized a few from the upper classes, but most were unfamiliar, stretching back years, perhaps even decades. Beside each name was a note, a summary of their torment. Forced to eat from the trash can. April 2017. Locker filled with spiders. October 2012. Textbooks thrown from the roof into the rain. March 2009. It was a meticulously kept ledger of cruelty. This was the true assignment sheet, The real homework. My eyes scanned frantically to the bottom of the final page, and a new wave of ice flooded my veins. In that same, perfect calligraphic script, a final note had been added. Thank you for the lessons. I will use them well. This was his origin. Aidan Park wasn't the ghost of a single bullied student seeking revenge. He was something far older, far more encompassing. He was the school's pain-given form. He was the aggregate of every silent scream, every swallowed tear, every lonely walk home filled with dread that had ever occurred within these walls. He was a tulpa, an entity willed into existence by decades of concentrated misery. He didn't have a past because he was born of everyone else's. He was the vengeful spirit of the collective, a ghost cobbled together from the suffering of hundreds. All the pieces slammed into place, forming a picture of absolute horror. His perfection wasn't human because he wasn't human. He was an idea, a principle, and his flawless work was the manifestation of his singular, unwavering purpose. The cold that surrounded him was the emotional void left by relentless cruelty. His homework wasn't for our teachers. It was a study of his own creators, the bullies. He watched them, learned their techniques, their pressure points, their fears. He visited their families while they slept, not to harm them, but to learn them, to understand the architecture of the lives he intended to dismantle. He was the lesson they had inadvertently taught, and now the student had become the master. Cruelty taught is cruelty returned. I couldn't stay. I transferred schools within the week, moving to a different city to live with my aunt. I threw myself into charity work, volunteering at shelters, trying to generate enough warmth and kindness to counteract the profound cold that had settled deep in my bones. But he was never far. Some nights, my phone would ring, the caller ID blank. I would answer, my hand shaking, and listen to the empty line, hearing nothing but the faint, rhythmic sound of steady, calm breathing on the other end. He was checking in. He was making sure his witness remembered. Then came the news reports, about a month later, as the last of the winter snow melted and the first spring blossoms began to appear. 7 students from my old school, all from the same class, had been found dead in their homes over the course of a single weekend. The media called it a bizarre, unexplained phenomenon. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The cause of death was the same for all 7. They had frozen solid. They were found in their bedrooms, sitting at their desks, a look of profound shock etched onto their icy faces. The heaters in their rooms were all on, blasting warm air that did nothing to touch the impossible ice that encased their bodies. But it was the final detail, the one that the police were desperately trying to keep from the press, that made my blood run cold all over again. Placed neatly on the desk in front of each of them was a single sheet of paper. It was a perfectly written essay, a final piece of homework titled, "What I Learned About Cruelty." Every essay was signed with the same name, in the same flawless, precise script, Aidan Park, a student who never was, and a teacher who would be forever. I sometimes wonder about that classroom. I imagine it empty and dark, long after the last bell has rung. I see a spectral figure moving between the desks, a register in its hand. A faint, calm voice echoes in the silence, calling out a roll call of names. The bullies, the victims, an endless list. Attendance being taken forever. The lesson is never over. The homework is never done. What do you think? Is the classroom really haunted? Or is it something else entirely? A system with chillingly equitable consequences? In many East Asian horror stories, especially in Sankey Korean horror, the supernatural isn't always a random evil. Instead, it's often the direct result of a rule being broken or a balance being upset. It's not just a ghost, it's karma wearing a scary mask. The idea of a specific time, like a 3:13 a.m., being a portal for spirits is a common metaphor, a moment when the veil between worlds is thinnest. Similarly, mirror law often depicts mirrors as not just reflective surfaces, but also as doors or traps for spirits. The entity in seat 31 may not be a monster, but a perfect reflection of the student's own sins, a chilling lesson taught perfectly. This touch quiet horror style shows that the scariest ghosts are those of our own making. Is it a vengeful spirit, or is the universe simply collecting debts? Let us know your theory in the comments below. And tell us, which rule are you going to break? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens in line 2 at 00.47 or in basement B23.